from inside me, outside, but inside, outside, it's not different for me. It's just my outside world. I think it's a reflection of my inside world. I think the interconnection, that's what's happening, I think. And,
whatever it is that we know, it is not separate from what we do to know it. There is that inseparability between knower and known. The question of creativity is key. That is, for an animal, for a living being to have a world, it's something that he actually shapes and creates over evolution and in its own history. It is not something that is given.
The opportunity to live precisely in a wilderness environment is an essential part of what we call the desert experience. Everyone needs a touch of wildness, physical wildness, in order to come really alive, because it's in these wild places that we touch what we can call the wildness of God.
We have to translate that into another thing in which not only a changing economy, in which economy itself, in its own radical fundamental conception, perhaps now is bound to change.
In the Carmelite tradition, there has always been this magnificent rhythm of solitude and togetherness, of contemplation and action. Mother Tessa Bielecki's hermitage is in the wilderness of Nova Scotia. Her life is that of the celibate, intoxicated by the writings of the medieval Spanish mystics.
Yeah. See, most of the people in Colorado...
Neurophysiologist Francisco Varela is also a Buddhist and states the fundamental similarity between the Buddhist theory of knowledge and modern cognitive science. His theoretical work concerns perception, where what we perceive is created by our very own mental processes. Contemporary Dutch artist Jacques van der Heyden became the observer of his own work. He sees himself painting the painting on the painting. Van der Heyden's awareness of the discrepancy between that which we already know and all that has yet to be discovered underlies his activities as a visual artist.
And for an artist, first comes his experience, I think, what he sees. And afterwards what he knows. Creativity, it's doing, it's not thinking, it's doing. The special thing is that you are making something and then everything is coming together in one point. That's no time for thinking, it's going in a moment. A moment is a part of a second. It's all thoughts of my whole life and it's coming together in 1 second. I can't think, it's impossible. Thinking is in time. It's creative at the moment, it has no time. That space is, you can make it and you can have it. There are two things. There's a space with, according to your awareness, your mind, I think, and that's the space you want to see or to make, if you say make, you make your own surrounding. That's an example of space.
Any of the form of senses is a way of bringing forth part of your world. And the fact that you see in 3 dimensions and in these kinds of colors, it is a way of obscuring. It's not a way of knowing. It's a way of obscuring because you think that that is really there. And in fact, vision is the most trompe-l'œil that you can imagine, because it gives you the impression that it's far away, that you couldn't possibly have anything to do with what is out there in space. But yet, the quality of space is inseparable from the way we're constituted. See? So in that sense, vision is the most tricky of all the senses, while the more closest senses, like touching, they do actually convey in themselves a notion of intimacy, which vision doesn't. So if you want to put it that way, vision is the greatest obstacle to knowing.
Art is not existing in the way of rules or any way of historical, in a historical way, but I want to make the rules by myself. It's part of creativity. There's not first the rules, and what can be art? Art is a result of an attitude. The rules are in it. You make the rules as you make the form. Thus you could say for art there are no rules. Perhaps there are, but not for me.
At a point when in your own process of minding, of awareness, there's a point where you let go of something and let something else come up. That there is precisely that discontinuity. Normally when we look at our mind, we have the feeling that there is great continuity, that it's a solid thing. But the creative process, and for that matter the spiritual process, is partly, I think, a learning to be much more light touch about what is happening in your mind, so that there's a moment when you can just pop, let go, literally put it down, drop it. And at that moment there is like a break, there is like a discontinuity, a gap, and within that gap there is that open ground, which is, you know, if you want to call it being with a capital B. And out of that there is the eternal source of novelty and insight. In fact, insight is something that happens at that point of juncture, of discontinuity. That's something, by the way, that in the practice of meditation one does see very, very precisely. But, you know, artists know this very well too. People always say, relax your mind, don't manipulate your state of mind. If you want to be really do something well, you cannot really be in control. You have to let go, put down. And of course, love is the greatest moment when that happens, because you actually put down things and you let yourself be touched.
I like to say that I was really tricked into this way of life. It was the last thing on earth I ever wanted for myself, and I was just completely caught off guard. I was making a retreat in my junior year of college. They said that the man who was coming to give the retreat was a hermit, and I was completely stunned meeting this man, because I had never met anyone who was so alive. And for me, the greatest value in life is vitality, is life itself. And I was completely swept away because I had never met a human being who was as alive as this man. And I said, if I could be half as alive as that, I would be happy. You nourish yourself in your solitude and are fed in very deep ways at the fountain of all life, and then out of that you may be sent to share that out in the world.
Perception, in the way of reflection, is the starting point, I think, for being artists. And you see what you want to see. That's first. What do you want to see? I think that we are living quicker and quicker, historically. And I say, oh, I will time the 6 newspapers in 6 minutes. It's possible. It's possible. You can learn it, to see it in 6 minutes. But you need a certain system of not of thinking in a normal way. If you go thinking and reading, it's impossible. You should only have a look, and in that way, our eyes are quick enough. In a fragment of a moment, I can see it so quickly, and it is not only the eyes, but the brains are quicker.
What the visual artists know and do and show is closer to the heart to what visual perception is. But there is a school within neuroscience and within cognitive science to which I adhere, to which I belong, if you want, that begins to question this notion that in fact the act of seeing, for example, we can take that as an example, but it would extend to any cognitive activity, hearing, moving,
thinking, is something that has to do with this information pickup and processing. That in fact, the fundamental act of perception is precisely that drawing out into the visible something that wasn't there as visible previously. That's a great genius of being alive, of having a brain, is to actually bring forth that reality. Now, if you try, for example, and this is something that I have done in my laboratory and others too, if you try to find the content where a color is, if you try to go out into the world and say, the color of this blue is, or your shirt there, is contained in some property of the light or some property of the tissue, you will not find it. And what is then marvelous is that then you follow into the opposite positions, and then color must be, as Goethe, for example, would have it, some sort of innate outer projection. Well, that doesn't work either, because in fact, you do find, once I see the blue, that there is something in what the physicists call the world that you have to take into account. But it's not simply finding the color. The whole point is that there is a circularity between I see the color, and therefore I can say what of the color is it that I'm perceiving, but I only perceive it because I do it in such a way that the color appears. So this kind of circularity between subject and object. What do you see and what you do in order to see it? These are two inseparable things. Now in your video, actually, Jacques, you said that. You said
it can come from inside, outside, but inside, outside, it's not different for me. It's just my outside world. I think it's a reflection of my inside world. And I think the interconnection, that's what's happening.
What is find it quite interesting is that within this transition, or somewhat revolutionary, I would say, views in cognitive science, we are actually coming to see that as the nerve, as the core, or as the beating heart of the cognitive process. That knowing is not a matter of just picking up what is out there. It's actually this circular creation of multiple worlds.
Color is a very beautiful case study for this multiversality, because the way you and I, primates, see what we call color is not at all the way other species see it. You see, it's easy for human beings to understand that different cultures have a different view of what, say, beauty or justice is. And we have no problems in accepting that we live in a multiverse of social constructs. What I'm trying to show with this research is that this multiversality carries on all the way down to how you feel, how you perceive. That when you see a color, which is identical for all human beings, there is completely cross-cultural. Nevertheless, that is proper to humans. Now, birds, mind you, have another dimension of color. That is, it's not that they see more colors. It's not that they see better colors. It's that their color space is unimaginable for us. Yet we're all walking around the canal there. We're all sharing something we can call a common ground. But this common ground is not something that it is pre-given. Each one of us has actually made it into a proper world. It's a multiversality. So ground is a very feminine quality of making something possible, instead of being a very masculine quality of the out there that you have to fit into. You see?
We all operate out of deeper levels of perception and deeper ways of knowing than rational ways of knowing. And Francisco has a lot to say about how we see as a scientist, because he's dealing with the brain. But Francisco is also a very serious Buddhist meditator, so he sees in many other ways besides this rational process that goes on in his brain. And as I listen and read him, I'm not sure when he's speaking as a Buddhist practitioner and when he's speaking as a scientist, which makes him a unique combination here. And spirituality is really a whole way of life, and it's really quite natural and spontaneous. And the more natural and spontaneous and unselfconscious it is, the better it is. And in other eras in history, people were more naturally and spontaneously spiritual. Spirituality is just an inevitable part of being human. And societies in the world today that are more primitive, as people would say, are definitely spiritual societies. It's westernized, industrialized society that's having difficulty living a so-called spiritual life.
In the Buddhist tradition, which is one of the reasons I'm so interested in it, is that the Buddhist tradition had made its own discovery of this groundless nature of human reality, that you cannot rely on some absolute truth or absolute judgment, that every form of knowing or every form of ignorance is contextual. The interesting thing about the Buddhist tradition is that they warn you from the very beginning that if you don't pay attention, if you don't have a profound work on what is it for you in your life to confront that lack of foundation, you're going to fall into the pitfall of that nihilism. Confronting this lack of foundation immediately makes it essential and points to the need for a human practice, for a human learning, for a human transformation into that. It is not enough to know it. It is not enough to understand it. It is not to have a scientific theory of it. You have to grow into it. The need to understand the immaturity with which we are born to confront it. Because maniacally we want to solidify things. Maniacally. So when you understand that you have no ground and yet you are maniacally solidifying it, you begin to lead a life that is completely estranged. Causality for the common mind is out there, is out in the world. That causality also applies to your own mind. That is, what you know and what you ignore is also a matter of an internal dynamics, of an internal causal pattern. And even the experimental psychologist, when he closes the door, usually the attitude is you close the door of the lab, you go home and you forget about it, right? Then you behave as if you had a very solid self. And you have very neat dogmatic ideas about what is right and what is wrong, and how to avoid the awareness of death and the awareness of aging and the pain of others and so on and so forth.
No more consciousness than consciousness in the moment. So then in one day or in 1 week you can say, but it's only the top of being. I see the sun is now and I see everything, the table, and I'm sitting here and I can see my fingers. That's the top.
Jacques is calling himself a visual artist, and what he does, we look at with our eyes. We're not just seeing with our eyes, and we're not just seeing because of what the brain does. We're seeing with the whole body. And I so appreciate Jacques as an artist because he says, well, you know, for years I didn't do art, and I don't even know if I'm an artist, because he's a person first. And that's what is most important, is that we meet as persons, not as categories. And if I get locked into the monk box, that's terrible, because I just happen to be a monk. I mean, that's a form that expresses something that's much more fundamental to me. And this also has a lot to do with perception, because if you're out there thinking monk, then you have all these preconceptions, and then I can't be who I really am, and I'm just Tessa. And you don't want to just sit here listening to talking boxes. Then you have to be able to make some kind of a connection in your own life. That's the point of our coming together. And what will Pinheiro, as the representative of the economy, learn about what it means to be a person from all these different perspectives, so that as a man of great influence in the world, and let's face it, the people who have the greatest influence here are all the people from the corporations. They have the money, they have the power. I have no power. I can make gestures. It's all very lovely, it's all very poetic. Francisco has no power. He has to depend on support of other people. Jacques has no power. But the power is in the hands of...
I have been listening to the 3 other panel members, and I understand that one of the objects of this meeting is to have us, them 3 or us 4, bare our souls to you. Well, I shall do so within limits. And I can't help but think of what this charming lady on my right said on the video up there. That we shouldn't really be working all the time. There should be time for play.
Life is all a rhythm and all a balance. But in the Western world, work has taken over to such an extent that in the United States today, psychologists are calling this a workaholic society and are treating work as an addiction, which is an extremely important revelation. And the antidote to that, obviously, is more leisure and is more play.
This is what I'm doing now. I'm playing.
I'm working.
Well, perhaps you are, that's it. But my life is the humdrum kind of life that one gets up in the morning, goes to the office, goes back home, and I happen to go to the office when it's dark, and I go home when it's dark, and it's there all the time, and Saturdays and Sundays it goes on all the time. It gets to the point, as you said, these, what do you call them, workaholics, or dreadful people that they are, they don't know what they are talking about. They can only learn something when they go out to play, as I'm doing. You go and throw these sort of balls of snow at the other one and you enjoy it. Well, I'm learning. But the only trouble is that if I learn too well, will I go back to my life? I have to, you know, I can't help it.
We see that we are not just here talking about what the problems are out there, but we're manifesting the problems. Mm-hmm. And we haven't gotten very far yet. And we are hoping that today is going to be a turning point and that it's possible to get farther. And again, I just want to come back to what I began with, because today I feel that we're meeting as persons, and that's what makes the difference. We're not meeting out of our boxes. There's been an awful lot of talk about progress, and in the name of science, progress. And we have, isn't this wonderful how far we've come? And now there's no more exploitation. Well, I don't see it that way. I think that there isn't a whole lot of progress. There's progress only on the material level. On non-material levels, I think we're less than barbaric. For example, this morning you talked about communications. Well, communications, what are all these communications systems if they don't lead to communion? And there isn't much communion. There's over-communication, which very often spoils communion between people. And Jacques has talked about, well, now we can read 6 newspapers, and we can read 6 newspapers in a flash. Well, yes, you can, if all you're looking for is information. You can get information very fast, but life is more than getting information. Life is meeting, life is relatedness. And now another point you made was about how we've created all these desires in people all around the world because of our fabulous communications and our television sets. Well, for one thing, what we put on our television sets isn't even real. I mean, it's all a bunch of lies about how happy you're going to be if you drive this car or smoke this cigarette. So we talk about all these other countries, and we're going to give them all these material things, or we give them money, or we don't give them money. But what do these other peoples have to offer us that we may be lacking?
What I think Tessa is pointing to us relentlessly is that without that kind of presence in our lives, of how do you finally confront or not confront the way of lodging yourself in being, of just relaxing into just the openness of what it is to be alive. It's not a past age, it's not a faith, it's not a belief, it's something much more absolutely immediate, which is the depth of just being. Now, you please tell me, why is it that in the West we have lost sight of that fundamental aspect of learning, of training? Why is it that you cannot go around and ask people, well, can I learn that? How do I go about having some kind of actual learning, practice, path to follow to let go of this constant quality of grasping onto the next thing that's happening, onto the next idea that you have, or the next memory that you might have? There is no space, and I think this is absolutely right. There is no space. We live lives with no space. Now, I'm not saying that that's the answer for everything, but without that, I find it very hard to believe that we can ask any question how to help. As you know, the Buddhists are very fond of saying, and I agree, before you ask yourself, how can I help? Ask yourself the question, how can I stop bothering?
And we've asked, well, where do all the problems come from? And we're looking for systems and projects and programs, when what is, I think, much more fundamental is that it begins with me. What is in my heart or not in my heart?
We don't accept that we are double. We are really double. It is the French writer Paul Valéry had said it. He wrote it in the 30s or in the 20s. It's not so new, but he said something like, it's not sex what is the principle, what is important. It's we are double in ourselves. We can talk with ourselves. We agree. We disagree with ourselves, and that's quite normal. That you say, I want my comfort, my positions, and everything I want, my pleasure. I'm responsible for humanity. I want both.
We should be aware of the fickleness of our minds. Nevertheless, we don't behave that way. We behave as if we know where we're going, or that we have these kinds of values, and we think that our thoughts for others are the good ones. Well, sometimes they aren't. What keeps you tied to your beliefs, to your attitudes, to your dear notions about what should be done? If one can become a little more lighter about those beliefs, a little more, therefore, response-able, even if it is little things, like getting along better with your neighbor, it will help. But that takes a learning. We don't provide our children with an occasion to explore that. We don't provide our adults with an occasion to explore that. We teach them mathematics. We never teach them how to tune the instrument of their life, of their beings. And I think that that's the question of spirituality in everyday life. Spirituality as the most fundamental training that's got to grow steadily and slowly to become response-able. True commitment to others has to be translated in commitment to oneself.
Becoming the beloved, or knowing what it feels like to be the other.
I think love is an energy, but the main question is, can we produce it by ourselves, or not, or will we get it from outside of our planet, any cosmological realm? I don't know. What do we know about it? Very little, I think. Only that it exists, and that it happens, as Tessa said. But first, the beginning point of where the origin is, you don't know. Love is an existing energy who is important, and then it comes to art. Sometimes I think without that art cannot exist, but I can prove it. I can say what special energy are working when I'm doing something with art. We need not, it's only questions, we need not the answers on the questions, because I think the question and the answer is together in art.
But is it greed or is it need that drives people by the million into the big cities, which is the city in Brazil that population has gone up from 1 million to 14 million or something this century.
That's my city.
That's your city.
Sao Paulo has around 14 million, and it should unfortunately grow by 500,000 every year. There is no doubt in my mind that television today, in my country at least, is responsible for this flow of people from backward areas to the big cities, because they come, they stay, they live in what we call favelas or slums or something like that, and disappointment comes in and back they go. But the reason why they flock to the big city first is in the hope that they can get for themselves what they see on the screen.
I was also asked to ask, and perhaps you would like to tackle this, whether this is not precisely what we are seeing in Eastern Europe, that the change in the economies there is precisely the pursuit of just that they want what they have seen on Western television, they want the goods, the cars, the whole consumer thing.
I'm very distressed by what happens with the Eastern countries, because we have this incredible equation: democracy equals market economy. When you see that in the Eastern countries some kind of opening from a situation that was stagnant, that was not particularly helpful, now is the equation democracy equals market value, then we're going to end up exactly where we know we are in the so-called industrialized countries, where I see the drug junkies in the metro in Paris not having particularly a great time, or we see the consequences in the third world. Let's start from upholding the need for some kind of solidarity, for some kind of human concern, which was present, as far as I can see, in the socialist thought. I still feel very much a socialist at heart that way, that if we are not going to build a society that is not based in some kind of caring, putting those values first, then we are going wrong. Now, that is not to say that you need to implement it in an intelligent way. Obviously, production forces are not just the mere figment of an imagination that needs to say, let's do it well. You need to put into action production means, and to have relationships of work, and to have merchandise circulate, and all the rest of it. I'm not denying that. But I think that part of the responsibility that we all have is to not let that landslide of consumerism simply continue to grow, and to denounce it as a scandal, which is what it is. And if managers in a company don't have a sense of a responsible company to understand how they affect the environment, what does it lead to have people consume more cars, and then what are we doing with that? 2 days ago, if I may say two lines on this, please. I was invited to be consulting on some very specific things to the Nissan car corporation, and I was very impressed with the question that these people were asking. They were actually interested in understanding how can they respond better to this overgrown of car selling. I mean, that seemed paradoxical, that Nissan was worried about selling too many cars.
Did you say sell fewer cars?
No, the thought was, what can we do to have an interesting company that would sell transportation means that would be more responsible? Now, that is the kind of thought we can have. It doesn't have to be the spirituality as a pure, vague kind of out of thin air. Spirituality comes down to the brass tacks of upholding the values and then implementing them. But hell, we have to start from asking the right questions, and that takes courage. Now, so it is very distressing. I have no sympathy with this market economy at all.
It's not just to express horror or to condemn the market economy. Most of the people are here because they are concerned. But to go a bit further and suggest how we can readjust this balance from the equation of democracy with consumerism, how we can improve the situation.
Your question is absolutely done right. And there are 20 different answers that each one has to give, and each one has to give the answer from the place where it's acting. what you are demanding is for a manager who is concerned about that, he's got to find ways of making his company responsible. We have to come back to put well-being at the center of the picture. And well-being is, first of all, knowing how to be well. And that's what we don't know. So the values of well-being have to be constantly reiterated and re-emphasized. Mm-hmm. And then at every stage we can, at every level we can, implement it. I was a little horrified, I must say, here yesterday, when the gentleman who was from the Deutsche Bank said, we have gone from Marx to markets. And my mind went sort of bong, because quite frankly, I think that the reason, as you know, one can say that there were dramatic mistakes made in the Stalinist era, there is a reason why the Marxist doctrine was interesting, is because it did put an emphasis on understanding the needs of others. And we cannot simply throw the baby with the bathwater. Yes, I don't want police, secret police and repression. I do want people to be able to speak their minds and all of that. Yes, but at the same time, if that is going to be completely replaced by a system where there is no solidarity values at the center, then I get really worried. And you know, that's what it seems to me that is, yes, the Berlin Wall probably fell because of the lack of freedom, but what you see is that the proposal for replacement is a proposal for replacement where the first thing that is talked about is, now how are you going to make all this new, big, better business work? And where are the remaining core of the other values going to go?
I certainly don't have any answers. I start with the questions as a businessman. And the questions are complex. And the questions are mind-boggling. But one thing I do know is that every single businessman here or outside there, and in any country where she or he lives, is the product of his or her own society. So if there's any accusation of business being whatever it is, polluting or not right with their employees or looking only at producing their product or whatever, that business is the mirror we started to talk about this morning of the environment in which they live. Where is the responsibility of a businessman? First of all, I'm getting a bit technical, but he uses other people's money. And the people who have given him the money pay their rents. So if he goes into this great adventure with other people's money, because he personally thinks that that's the way he should do it, and it goes bust, those other people cannot pay the rent. Problem.
What has the highest priority, your responsibility as a human being or your responsibility as a businessman? And you have to find that relation for yourself. If being a human being means that you have to think first of the people who made the investments possible, yes, then you should do that. That's your conscience.
When our power has increased in such a way that we have produced those ecological, I should not call them disasters, imbalances, I think that business today on the global scale gets another dimension. And this dimension is inescapably linked with political issues, with moral issues, and with spiritual problems. So I think we'd like to disentangle and discriminate the intention of the business people and the business community from the intrinsic nature of business today, which due to these global proportions can only survive as business, disrupting the cosmic rhythms, for lack of a better word. And that, I think, is our problem. That's why the problem cannot be just solved by intimacy or just saying that we should all be good fellows and love one another. We have to translate that into another thing in which not only a changing economy, in which economy itself, in its own radical fundamental conception, perhaps now is bound to change?
I think fundamentally we have a problem called desire. And greed. You see, greed. You know, and feeding that. It's like giving salt water. And that's, I think, there is a responsibility here. How much do we feed to make more thirsty? That's the main issue. The desire and the consumer. There has to be responsibility in balance. Because if the feeder does not stop, are not responsible for what they're feeding, inevitably you're going to be thirsty. This is a very important question. I think this is the root of most of our human problems, is desire and greed.
I think that a businessman who holds that he has only questions denies that his whole enterprise is one big answer to what he sees as problems in society, in the market, and so on. And Mr. van Vlissingen suggests that a businessman is not free in giving his answer. He says, well, I'm responsible to the people from whom I have borrowed the money, and so on and so forth. I think that entrepreneurs in our society are very free and are responsible for their private answer. And if a businessman says, my values, well, they are not interesting, I think there is a kind of hypocrisy.
The most powerful group of people in the world who can make the most difference are the businesses. I think that's a fact. Government is not as powerful as business. Certainly spirituality and science and art are not as powerful as business. So that I think that where there is that kind of power, there's that much more responsibility.
Madam, you live in a hermitage. Art meets science in spirituality in a changing economy. That's where some change is, we hope, to slowly effect. But I think one thing to bear in mind that we sit here, discuss, even though there are very eminent people here, but however, we don't affect very much in the world as a whole, really. That's a fact. However, we can initiate ideas, because these ideas could slowly be distributed in business and companies. We cannot dictate to anybody what to do. Man cannot say what spiritual people can do. Or spiritual people have no power over business people. We just have to share ideas, just share and hope some common sense can come out of it. There are many eminent people here, people who could actually, especially from the business world, can make a difference. That's what we hope, really. That's why I was very happy to come to this conference, because of that.
Good, because he's an artist.
Yeah. Anthropologist Gregory Bateson once pointed out that the main problem of our society is the relationship between civilization and addiction, something we do not really understand very well. So I want to, the question put to the panel, if addiction is something that, is it inherently human? Is it something we must understand before we get rid of it? Do we need to get rid of it at all?
You touch on something that it seems to me quite central. That in fact, this notion of holding on to fixed ideas and fixed values is precisely an addiction to oneself. Ain't that funny? That biology, our entire body, the entire evolution of our nervous system is so that we come to bring forth the world in which we live in, and then we want to make them stable. We don't want them to change. We want to hold on to how we are, and then when, you know, in the case of human beings, you have language and a kind of a societal identity through language.
So we actually emerge or arise within language. Now, language doesn't belong to me or to you, to anybody. Language, in fact, exists like air. It is a medium where we all actually exist. And it is not that we actually learn language, it's more that language learns us. In that sense, it's very intimate, because in that sense, myself and yourself have exactly the same source. And we human beings continue to exchange language, and we think that that is just a process of quote-unquote communication. From this point of view, communication is in fact constitution. It is being who you are. Of course, it is not the only thing you are, but it is at the very center of human beings to show up in language, to be brought forth within language. And without language, there is no possibility of having that you call you.
I can tell you that I have things that I believed for years which I don't believe now. For example, I used to think that the brain was a computer made out of meat. That's how I was brought up in the scientific profession. I used to think there was such a thing as information. I don't believe in information anymore. I think it's just an absolute nonsense idea, as much as the phlogiston idea was in the physics of the 19th century, some sort of virtual flow, you know. So yes, I used to believe in that, people still do, and I don't. So certainty has a way of getting to you and then you let go of that. There is one relative certainty which I see and I uphold and I will be willing to argue as a scientist, which is to renew our sense of what is this relationship, this knowledge relationship we have to the world. That the traditional image of a knower as something that picks up information from the environment and adapts to an already made reality can give way, by good scientific reason, to a view of a knower which is in a relationship of co-determination, of co-definition with its knowing world, the world in which it finds itself. Right? That idea of a shift, I would say, from a pre-Cartesian to a post-Cartesian view of knowledge is a radical step for the Western tradition. I mean, the moment you change your outlook on, for example, how does your perception work, how does your brain work, there are very tangible effects. And one of the tangible effects, for example, if you want to be a real scientist, is how do you think of building creatures? We call them robots, right? Artificial cognitive devices that might look as if they have a very autonomous behavior. That is a radical effect on this world. In other words, yes, there are certain things that become possible. We might not want them, but I'm telling you, I am profoundly convinced that this new post-Cartesian trend in the cognitive sciences and the brain sciences will eventually make it possible, very quickly, I think, to make machines like in that wonderful film Blade Runner, which will look very autonomous, which would be creatures that would care for themselves and have some kind of real autonomy, not the kind of silly machines we're used to. And that is a perfectly enormous ethical confrontation that this society will have soon, just as strong as building or not building an atomic bomb. So yes, definitely, these things have an impact. They become concrete, you know. So it is not just a very effete epistemology, which it is. It is also down-to-earth, very tangible societal transformation.
And the biggest pessimist there is. But I see all the impossibilities there are in the world now. And there can be other possibilities, or one possibility we don't see. And any moment of love has no fear. You could say just a moment. But it has no duration. You can take a duration of it. You can only say it's a special energy, a special human energy. We know what it is, everyone knows what it is. And it's just against fear. There's no fear at the moment of love. And the process is always better than what you can think. The process is like nature. It's going from step by step to things, and this has a character. We are born in the same way, I think. We are born with a certain character, with genetic, genetic program, and that's all we have. When you're born, it's all complete, you could say. And in that program, you should live, and you should make the best of it. To take all of it together, and that's my idea. That's your whole life, from the beginning to the end. And you shouldn't order it, but it is ordered, and you have to go in the order. That's the idea. I think I like that idea, but I hope it's possible.
As I look out on the world today, I see it with a very dark view. We call this in our community the dark night of the church. And times are quite dreadful, I think. And they call for tremendous heroism and tremendous self-sacrifice. Because what we really are about is to be giving to the world, not taking from the world. And that's part of the problem with the world today, is that there are too many people who are taking from it and not giving back to it, and not walking lightly on the earth, which is really what we're all called to do.